Due to the graphic nature of the content of this video, viewer discretion will be advised. We will be discussing extreme violence against women in the most terrible, terrible form. So if you do not want to watch a video pertaining to that, please click off now. Hello, dears and dudes. My name is Snyderman, and welcome to Snyderman Teaches. No, but really, welcome to Snyderman Teaches, the series where we look at historic events and their importance to modern society. Today, in the spirit of Halloween, happy Halloween, we are going to be looking at Jack the Ripper. All right, so before we really dive into the content here, it needs to be stated that this is by no means a complete examination of Jack the Ripper. We are really going to be looking at the 5 canonical victims, so the big 5 victims that people believe Jack the Ripper killed. But we need to acknowledge here that Jack the Ripper is believed to potentially have up to 11 more victims after these 5. But these tend to be the 5 that people are like, yeah, these are definitely victims of Jack the Ripper. Second, we need to understand that when we talk about suspects, we are really talking about just the different theories. And we're actually going to be examining 3 or 4 different theories at the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. But Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that terrorized the East End of London, specifically the district of Whitechapel. And we know that Jack the Ripper really spent the end of the summer of 1888 really giving the police a run for their money. And that's what we're going to be examining right now. Mary Ann Wichels, a sex worker in Whitechapel, is the first victim of Jack the Ripper. She is the one that kind of starts the MO for Jack. He only targeted sex workers, and Whitechapel was an area in East London that was in high demand and high supply for sex workers. Okay, so we have kind of this very shady area that Jack is working in. And Mary Ann Wichels kind of fit that mold. And her body is discovered by Charles Cross on August 31st of 1888. He said he was walking down Bucks Row. He notices like a bundle of cloth at the west end of the street. He begins to approach it. That's when Robert Paul also joins him. They approach the body together, and they find the body of Wichels. Her throat had been slashed. Her body had been disemboweled, and the police assumed that she was dead approximately 30 minutes before her body was discovered, meaning that when Cross and Paul had stumbled on her body, the killer was very close by. So Jack was probably in the area when his first victim was discovered. And so now an investigation begins. The police are wanting to figure out who killed this girl. And then about a week after the first discovery, we get a second victim by the name of Annie Chapman. She's another sex worker in the East End. Her body is discovered at 29 Hanbury Street on September 8th of 1888 by a resident of the apartment building that was there at the time, John Davis. And much like Wichels before her, Chapman's throat had been cut, but this time the murder gets more gruesome. Upon autopsy, it is revealed that her womb had been removed. Okay, so she had basically been dissected, if you will. And it's this fact alone that leads the doctor working with the police force, a doctor by the name of George Baxter Phillips, to come up with the theory that the killer had to have knowledge of anatomy based on the precision and the manner in which her womb had been taken. So this kind of leads us to the question of, could the killer, Jack the Ripper, be a doctor? Could he be a practicing physician? So we have kind of this theory that has begun to develop, and they are kind of researching and looking into that until the Central News Agency in London gets this letter in late September of 1888, and it reads this: Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for the jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, and I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it, no luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. So this is where the moniker, the name of Jack the Ripper, is born, with this letter. Now, if this letter is authentic, if it's from the real killer, then we very clearly have somebody with psychological issues that we're dealing with. Not only is he killing people, but the fact that he's still writing like haha and lol in his letters. That is kind of the mark of a true psychopath, or maybe just a teenager texting in 2020. Anyway, Jack the Ripper's moniker is made here. But one thing that we do need to acknowledge is that this could have been, not saying it was, not saying it wasn't, it could have been the work of a journalist at this point. It could have been somebody that was just trying to join in on this big story, because at this point people are latching onto this story. It's been picked up by the media outlets, been picked up by the newspapers, and the people of London are paying attention. They're wanting to know who this killer is. They're wanting the police to do their job and find this guy. And 3 days later, after that letter is released in the papers, we have two more victims. We have Elizabeth Stride, who is killed on Berner Street. Her body is discovered by Louis Daimschutz. And what's weird, and the way Stride doesn't fit the typical MO of Jack the Ripper, is only her throat is cut. There's no disembowelment. There's no removal of organs. There's none of this. And what this suggests is that Jack was probably interrupted. Okay, Jack was probably in the middle of this murder and was about to get caught. Okay, and so 45 minutes later, after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride, the body of Catherine Eddowes is discovered. And it's just to the west of where Stride's body was found. So we're in kind of the same area. It's just a couple blocks away. And this is the second victim on the same night. And much like Stride, Eddowes had her throat cut. But this is where Jack escalates. Not only was her throat slashed, her uterus was removed, We see a missing kidney, and we see that her face was severely disfigured and cut up to the point where Eddowes was almost unrecognizable. So now we have the second victim on the same night, but this is where Jack slips up. After the murder of Eddowes, Jack would have circled back. He would have been headed east, back towards Stride's body, away from Eddowes' body and towards Stride's. And this is where he drops a piece of Eddowes' apron. Okay? This is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the Jack the Ripper murders that we currently have. It's a bloody piece of cloth, and it's found by a gentleman by the name of Alfred Long. He's a resident of an apartment complex on Goldstone Street, and he finds this bloody piece of cloth in the doorway of the complex. And it's only a few blocks away from Eddowes' body. It's only a few blocks to the west of where Stride was. So it's kind of right in this central location. And Jack also inscribed in chalk this statement: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." What this does is this kind of emphasizes the anti-Semitism that would have been present within London society at this point. It points to the fact that maybe Jack the Ripper was Jewish. Possible theory. But in a deeper context, and in perhaps a more important context, it's potentially proof that Jack was an East Ender. It was potentially proof that he lived in the area, because police were swarming that area at this point. So he would have had to have gone through police investigation areas. He would have had police all over the place, and he would have needed to be inconspicuous. He would have needed to be someone that wouldn't have stood out in the crowd. So, potentially, Jack is an East Ender. Then, a few days later, on October 1st, 1888, or the next morning, actually, the police department receives a letter. And the newspaper also receives a copy of this letter before the general public even knows what's going on. Okay, so news about this double homicide had not gotten out yet. And the letter reads like this: "I was not coddling, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jack's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit. Couldn't finish straight off. Had not the time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." So that sparks off a whole other part of this investigation. This is kind of Jack's way of just being like, hey, we're playing a little game here, guys. And then 2 weeks later, on October 16th of 1888, George Lusk, who was one of the lead investigators in a private investigation at the time into these murders, he receives a letter. He receives the famous Jack the Ripper letter titled "From Hell." But this letter has been proven to be a prank by a medical student. It's basically just a way for a probably bored young individual to be involved in one of the major events at the time. It's basically the annoying Twitter of the day, if you will. And it reads like this: "From hell, Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. To other piece I fried, and I ate it, was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." So, a couple things to note about this letter. One, the spelling is atrocious. Okay? Not consistent with the other Jack the Ripper letters. Two, it did come with a kidney, or a piece of a kidney. It did come with a human kidney. At the time, they were thinking, okay, it's probably like from an animal or something, but upon testing, it did come back that it was from a human. But this letter itself, like I said, has been disproven. It has been disproven to be a prank from a medical student at the time. But shortly after the From Hell letter is sent, we get the fifth and final canonical victim. The final victim that we know of for sure from Jack the Ripper. And her body is discovered on November 9th. Her name is Mary Kelly. Much like the other four women, she is also a sex worker in the East End. Her body was actually found by her landlord in her apartment. So unlike the other four, her body is actually found in her house. Okay, not a public place. Her landlord was coming around to collect rent and discovers Kelly's body. This is the worst of the five victims. Kelly was disemboweled, and upon accounts, she was virtually skinned down. Basically, all of her skin had been removed. Police are reporting that it looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. And this is where the known Jack the Ripper murders stop. This is where they just kind of end. So that gets us into some theory. With all the investigation that the police did, they were able to develop a profile. A few people had claimed they had seen someone around the time of the murders. They were able to describe Jack the Ripper. So the cops had a profile. The FBI had a profile. He was a man of fair complexion, very stockily built, had a mustache. He was about 5'5" to 5'7". He was about 25 to 35 years old. He was described as being perfectly sane, frighteningly normal, but very capable of extraordinary cruelty. He was often seen wearing a dark overcoat and a dark hat, one of those stereotypical top hats for the time. And obviously, from the way that he handled the bodies, we had talked previously about how he was possibly a doctor. He possibly had some medical background. And that leads us into some theories about who is Jack the Ripper? Who was he? And keep in mind, these are only some of the theories that are out there. These are by no means all of the theories. I just picked a couple of the ones that I think are the most likely. They all have kind of that component of, yeah, it's that guy. But they also all have that component of, maybe not. I don't know. So our first suspect is a Polish Jewish individual by the name of Aaron Kasminski. And he lived in Whitechapel, so he fits the bill of being an East Ender, somebody that would have known his way around the East End where these bodies were. He was thrown into insane asylums shortly after the Jack the Ripper murders, the canonical five, ended. He was actually thrown into an insane asylum in 1889. He had a temper. Okay, he was known for his hatred of women. He was very sexist. He was known to be especially angry and vile towards sex workers of the time. He was seen in the area the night of the double murder, so it was very likely he could have been around and been able to kind of sneak around the police because he was living there. And he's one of your most famous suspects because he is actually named in the book Naming Jack the Ripper. If you haven't read that book, please pick it up. It's a good read. Russell Edwards, the author, uses DNA evidence to make the claim that Kasminski is Jack the Ripper. And the main evidence that Edwards has is on Edo's shawl. And Edwards basically says, yeah, using DNA evidence, I was able to get it tested. They found not just Edo's blood, but in theory, they found Jack the Ripper's semen on what was left of Edo's shawl. And upon DNA tests, the DNA matched Kasminski. They kind of traced back some of his family members that are living at the time, and supposedly the DNA matched. However, the DNA testing that was done has come into scrutiny. There has been a widely publicized mistake that was made during the testing. Basically, when they were publishing the results, somebody hit the wrong button on the keyboard when they were publishing the results, and basically the number that they used in this publishing that said, yeah, it's Kasminski, would have proven it was Kasminski if it was actually the right thing. See, because what happens is the evidence they really have traces back to like 90% of European people. So that kind of takes Kasminski out of the for sure category. And this testing was never peer reviewed in the first place, which actually leads us to believe that maybe Kasminski isn't Jack the Ripper. We really don't know. Again, if you want to know more about Kasminski and his connection to Jack the Ripper or potential connection to Jack the Ripper, go pick up the Naming the Jack the Ripper novel. Our second suspect is the famous painter Walter Stekert. This is actually a theory that is presented by Patricia Cornwell, and she basically has devoted her life into connecting Stekert to the Jack the Ripper crimes. She, in 2001, I believe, spent £2 million trying to prove her case, trying to say that Stekert is Jack the Ripper. And when you look at the evidence that she's collected, she might have a point. Cornwell makes the case that Stekert was very obsessed with Jack the Ripper. He painted a painting known as Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. He did a painting that basically mirrored the body of Kelly, so the final victim, specifically the position that the body was found in. And you have another sketch that he did that matched the facial disfiguration of Edo's, that fourth victim that we talked about. And we also have the weird notion that Stekert cosplayed as Jack the Ripper. Now, this is prior to cosplay. It might have even been prior to Halloween becoming a big thing. But you also have to recognize this is an era where Europe did have big carnivals. They did have these big events where dressing up was not necessarily completely out of the normal, but Stekert is definitely weird. Okay? He is dressing up as Jack the Ripper. So he's definitely a little odd. But probably some of her most important evidence is the fact that she had some of Stekert's letters analyzed, okay, chemically and just fiberly and things like that. And when you compare the paper that Stekert's letters were written on to the Jack the Ripper letters, there are stunning similarities to the composition of the paper. The papers that these letters were written on came from a handmade paper run of only about 24 sheets. In other words, the chances that Stekert and Jack had paper from the same batch are extremely unlikely unless they're the same person. Okay, so the Stekert theory, pretty solid. But then we get to another solid suspect, a guy by the name of Joseph Barnett. Okay, Barnett is actually a roommate of Jack's final victim, Mary Kelly. And Joseph is known to have possibly lived in 10 different locations across East London. He had more than one spot that he stayed. In other words, he knew the area. Okay. But Barnett kind of had some weird stuff going on as well. Barnett was often noted as introducing Kelly as his wife, even though she was only his roommate. They had no romantic connection that we really know of at this point. We know that Barnett strongly disagreed with Kelly's life as a sex worker. He could have committed the first murders as a way to scare her off the streets. And actually, if that was the case, it worked for a while. There's a time in Kelly's life where we know she stopped being a prostitute. She stopped being a sex worker in East London. And it really isn't until Barnett becomes unemployed that Kelly returns to life on the streets. She returns to her life as a sex worker, and that leads to fights between the two. Basically, Kelly brought two of her friends home, two more sex workers, and we know that the two had a very major fight after these two women were brought home. So much so that a window was broken. Not long after the fight, Barnett moves out. Okay. And a week and a half later, Kelly's body is discovered. Okay. And when you examine Kelly's murder, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Kelly was probably killed in her sleep. Her clothes were folded in a very orderly manner. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that she didn't struggle. She was in a nightgown. She was laying in her bed. There's so much there that suggests she was probably murdered in her sleep. And Barnett, we know, still at this time had access to the apartment, to the living quarters, and was probably able to commit this crime. Barnett also knew a lot of the sex workers through Kelly, and that meant that on the previous murders prior to Kelly's, he would have had the element of surprise. They would have had their guard down, and he would have been able to kill these girls. Another thing that goes against Barnett is he fits the profile. He fits the 5'5" to 5'7", 25 to 35 years old, mustache, stocky, fair complexion, kind of a normal guy. He fit the bill. Okay. So Barnett's case to be Jack the Ripper, pretty good. Pretty good. But here's my favorite. Okay, this is the one that I buy into. I really like this theory, actually. And it really provides a big explanation into why he was never found. I personally think, and other historians think, that Jack the Ripper might not be Jack at all, but Jill. Could Jack the Ripper actually have been a midwife? A woman that would have been well versed in anatomy, would have been able to be covered in blood and nobody would have really thought twice about it due to her work, meaning she would have blended in when the police were doing their investigations. Okay? And she wouldn't have been suspected. No one would have looked at her and said she did it. So I'm of the belief, and I'm in that category of historians that say this, that Jack the Ripper could have been a midwife, could have been a woman that was kind of on a moral crusade against the sex workers of East London and was using her career as a midwife to kind of hide what she was doing. When we examine Jack the Ripper in the context of history, he, in many circles, is considered to be the first serial killer in history. But even bigger than that, Jack the Ripper tells us a lot about the human psyche. People, no matter who they are, tend to be interested in serial killers for whatever reason. There's a major morbid fascination, not just with Jack the Ripper, but with people like the Zodiac Killer, Ted Bundy, the Golden State Killer. For whatever reason, our human nature kind of draws us into wanting to know who these people are and kind of what makes them tick, what makes them work. That's what makes Jack the Ripper so important. Because not only are we still sitting here in 2020 wondering who he is, telling his story, talking about him, but back in the day, people were enthralled with his story. They wanted to know who he was. They wanted the police to catch this guy. And the commissioner of the police in Scotland Yard had to resign because he was so frustrated that they couldn't find him. Jack the Ripper serves as kind of the ghost story for modern times, if you will. So, with that, if you want me to cover anything in this series, leave me a comment down below. I've got a couple things that I've gotten put on the list because of your comments. Look for those to be coming up, but I'm always looking for more. I want to keep you interested, so leave those in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you're not already. Share this with everybody. Get a little bit of learning in you, and have a great day. See ya.